The emergency briefing room at the Department of Justice had never seen anything quite like this. Attorney General Pam Bondi stood before a wall-mounted display showing cross-sectional engineering diagrams that looked more like blueprints for a subway system than anything associated with drug trafficking. The tunnel network discovered beneath the Arizona-Mexico border represented the most sophisticated smuggling operation in American history, and its implications were staggering enough to keep the nation's top law enforcement officials awake for days. The room itself had been swept for electronic surveillance devices 3 times in the past 24 hours. The classified nature of the tunnel discovery meant that only 12 individuals in the entire federal government were authorized to know the full scope of what had been uncovered. Each person present had been personally vetted by Bondi herself, their security clearances enhanced, and their communications monitored to prevent any possibility of information leaking to cartel intelligence networks. The walls were lined with high-resolution photographs taken by remote-controlled robots that had been inserted into the tunnel system. The images revealed a level of construction sophistication that defied every assumption about cartel capabilities. Concrete walls reinforced with steel rebar, professional electrical installations with backup power systems, and ventilation equipment that would have been impressive in a legitimate commercial construction project. But what had truly shocked federal investigators was the discovery of branching tunnel networks that suggested this was not an isolated project. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in absolute secrecy had identified what appeared to be at least 4 additional tunnel systems within a 50-mile radius of the initial discovery. The implications were terrifying. If the cartels had invested this heavily in tunnel construction along one sector of the border, similar networks likely existed along the entire 2,000-mile frontier between the United States and Mexico. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bondi began, addressing the assembled heads of the DEA, FBI, Border Patrol, and Homeland Security, "what you're about to see will fundamentally change how we understand cartel operations along our southern border." She clicked a remote control, and the display shifted to show satellite imagery of seemingly innocent desert terrain stretching across both sides of the international boundary. The assembled officials represented decades of experience fighting drug cartels, human trafficking networks, and border security threats. DEA Administrator James Patterson had personally overseen operations that had resulted in the capture of dozens of cartel leaders. FBI Deputy Director Sarah Martinez had spent 15 years investigating transnational criminal organizations. Border Patrol Chief Maria Santos had worked every sector of the southern border during her 30-year career, yet none of them had ever encountered anything approaching the sophistication of what federal agents had discovered beneath the Arizona desert. The discovery had begun 3 weeks earlier, when Border Patrol agent Maria Castellanos noticed something unusual during a routine patrol near Nogales, Arizona. Castellanos, a second-generation Border Patrol agent whose father had worked the same sector for 20 years before retiring, had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect anomalies in the desert environment. Her colleagues called it desert sense, an intuitive understanding of what belonged and what didn't in the harsh landscape of the Sonoran Desert. The seismic sensors designed to detect foot traffic had registered vibrations that didn't match typical patterns of human movement. The readings suggested heavy machinery operating underground, but in an area where no construction projects were known to exist. More puzzling was the timing. The vibrations occurred during daylight hours, when smuggling activity was typically minimal, suggesting that whatever was happening underground was substantial enough to continue around the clock. Castellanos had initially dismissed the readings as equipment malfunction. The seismic sensors were sensitive enough to detect everything from passing aircraft to distant mining operations, and false alarms were common. But the pattern persisted for several days, always in the same location, always during the same hours. Her training had taught her to trust technology, but her experience had taught her to trust her instincts even more. Castellanos, a 12-year Border Patrol veteran who had grown up in the area, trusted her instincts enough to request a ground-penetrating radar survey of the location. What the radar revealed defied belief. A tunnel system extending nearly 2 miles underground, complete with electrical systems, ventilation, and what appeared to be railway tracks. The ground-penetrating radar survey had required special authorization from Border Patrol headquarters, and Castellanos had been forced to submit a detailed justification for the expensive and time-consuming procedure. Her sector chief, a political appointee with limited field experience, had initially denied the request as wasteful spending based on hunches and feelings. But Castellanos had persisted, enlisting the support of her patrol partner, Agent Roberto Gutierrez, whose own family had been victimized by cartel violence in Juarez. Together, they had documented weeks of anomalous seismic readings, compiled photographs of disturbed soil patterns visible only to trained eyes, and even conducted informal interviews with local ranchers who had reported unusual nighttime truck traffic in areas where no legitimate commercial activity occurred. Their persistence had eventually convinced the sector chief to authorize a limited radar survey, primarily to demonstrate that their concerns were unfounded and put the matter to rest. The radar operator, a civilian contractor named Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had spent 15 years conducting geological surveys for the Department of Defense, had expected to spend a few hours confirming the absence of any underground structures. Instead, she had discovered what appeared to be an underground complex that rivaled military installations she had surveyed in Afghanistan and Iraq. "I've conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys on 4 continents, Dr. Walsh had told Castellanos after reviewing the initial results. "I've mapped underground bunkers, built by professional military engineers, subway systems constructed by major metropolitan governments, and mining operations developed by multinational corporations. What you've found here is more sophisticated than most of those projects." The initial radar survey had revealed the primary tunnel extending 8 miles from a point 300 meters south of the international border to a location in a residential neighborhood of Tucson. But more detailed analysis had shown branching passages, parallel tunnels, and what appeared to be underground storage areas large enough to accommodate substantial quantities of contraband. "Agent Castellanos," Bondi said, nodding to the woman who had initiated the investigation, "your attention to detail may have uncovered the largest criminal infrastructure project in North American history. The tunnel network wasn't just impressive in its scope, it was terrifying in its implications." Intelligence gathered over the following weeks revealed that the Sinaloa cartel had spent over 3 years and an estimated $50 million constructing what amounted to an underground highway system for smuggling drugs, weapons, and human trafficking victims into the United States. The financial investment alone was staggering. $50 million represented more than the annual budget of many American cities, and the cartels had spent it on a single smuggling operation. This suggested revenue streams that dwarfed previous estimates of cartel financial capabilities. If they could invest $50 million in one tunnel system, their total financial resources were likely measured in billions rather than millions. But the investment had been carefully planned and executed with military precision. Financial investigators had traced the funding through a complex network of shell companies, cryptocurrency transactions, and offshore banking arrangements that had successfully concealed the project's true nature from American financial monitoring systems. The cartels had essentially created their own private infrastructure development program, complete with project management, engineering consultation, and construction oversight that would have impressed legitimate government contractors. The construction timeline revealed the sophistication of the operation. Phase 1 had involved extensive geological surveys conducted under the cover of a legitimate environmental consulting firm. Phase 2 had included the purchase of construction equipment through straw purchasers who had no apparent connection to cartel organizations. Phase 3 had been the actual tunnel construction, conducted entirely during nighttime hours, using equipment that had been modified to reduce noise and vibration signatures. Most disturbing was Phase 4, the operational phase that had been running for over 8 months before Agent Castellanos had detected the anomalous seismic readings. Intelligence analysis suggested that the tunnel had been used to transport over 10 tons of cocaine, countless weapons, and hundreds of human trafficking victims into the United States. The revenue generated during the operational phase had likely already recovered the initial construction investment, making the tunnel system profitable beyond the cartel's most optimistic projections. DEA Administrator James Patterson stood to present the technical details. Patterson had spent 25 years fighting drug cartels, from street-level dealers in Detroit to kingpins in Colombia, but even his extensive experience hadn't prepared him for what federal agents had discovered beneath the Arizona desert. Patterson's career had been built on understanding cartel evolution. He had witnessed their transformation from relatively simple drug trafficking organizations to sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated like multinational corporations. He had seen them adopt advanced communications technology, financial instruments, and even human resources management practices that rivaled legitimate businesses. But the tunnel system represented a quantum leap in criminal sophistication that challenged every assumption about cartel capabilities. "The engineering sophistication is unlike anything we've encountered," Patterson began, his voice carrying a mixture of professional admiration and deep concern. "These aren't crude smuggling tunnels dug by hand. This is a multi-level system with concrete reinforcement, industrial ventilation systems, electrical power supplied by solar panels disguised as legitimate installations, and even underground rest areas with sleeping quarters and supply storage." The technical specifications were remarkable. The primary tunnel measured 8 feet in height and 6 feet in width, large enough to accommodate small vehicles or substantial quantities of contraband. The tunnel walls were lined with reinforced concrete that would have met commercial building standards in most American cities. Professional-grade ventilation systems maintained air quality that was actually superior to many office buildings, while redundant electrical systems ensured continuous lighting and power for mechanical equipment. Most impressive was the transportation system. Rather than relying on human porters to carry contraband through the tunnel, the cartels had installed a narrow-gauge railway system with motorized carts capable of transporting over a ton of material per trip. The railway system included passing sidings that allowed carts to travel in both directions simultaneously, maximizing the tunnel's operational efficiency. But the discovery that had shocked federal investigators was the existence of multiple parallel tunnels connected by cross passages, creating a redundant network that could continue operating even if portions were discovered and blocked. The parallel tunnels served different functions, one optimized for high-volume drug transportation, another designed for human trafficking with basic sanitation facilities and rest areas, and a third dedicated to weapons smuggling with specialized storage for ammunition and explosives. The cross passages between tunnels were equally sophisticated, featuring blast doors that could isolate sections of the network if law enforcement breached one tunnel. Security systems included motion sensors, closed-circuit television monitoring, and communication equipment that allowed operators to coordinate activities across the entire underground complex. "We're essentially looking at an underground military installation," Patterson continued, clicking through photographs that showed construction quality that exceeded many legitimate commercial projects. The level of engineering expertise suggests they consulted with professional architects and construction firms, possibly without revealing the true nature of the project. Most disturbing was the sophistication of the concealment systems. On the Mexican side, the tunnel entrance was hidden beneath a legitimate manufacturing facility that produced automobile parts for export to the United States. The facility, Industrias Frontera S.A., had operated for 5 years as a maquiladora, producing brake components for Ford and General Motors. The company employed over 200 workers, maintained proper labor and environmental compliance, and had even received recognition from the Mexican government for its contribution to regional economic development. The legitimate business operations provided perfect cover for the heavy machinery and construction materials needed to build the tunnel system. Concrete trucks, earth-moving equipment, and construction workers were routine sights at the facility, allowing tunnel construction to proceed without attracting attention from Mexican authorities or suspicious neighbors. Even more sophisticated was the integration of tunnel construction with legitimate manufacturing operations. Excess concrete from tunnel construction was used for facility improvements, while excavated soil was mixed with industrial waste from manufacturing operations and disposed of through legitimate channels. Intelligence analysis revealed that Industrias Frontera had been established specifically to support tunnel construction, representing a 3-year investment in creating credible business cover for criminal operations. The company's financial records, reviewed by forensic accountants, showed legitimate profits from manufacturing operations alongside sophisticated money laundering schemes that cleaned drug proceeds through the company's export revenues. On the American side, the tunnel emerged in the basement of what appeared to be a family-owned restaurant in a Hispanic neighborhood of Tucson. Casa Guadalajara had operated normally for 2 years, serving authentic Mexican cuisine to unsuspecting customers, while serving as the endpoint for one of the most significant smuggling operations in American history. The restaurant was owned by the Morales family, immigrants who had legitimately operated small businesses in Tucson for over a decade. Federal investigators had determined that the family had been coerced into cooperation through threats against their relatives still living in Mexico. The cartels had essentially weaponized the family ties that connected Mexican-American communities to their countries of origin, using threats of violence against family members to ensure cooperation from otherwise law-abiding American residents. The basement modifications were ingenious in their concealment. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall that appeared to be a standard utility room. The false wall was constructed with the same materials as the restaurant's legitimate basement renovations, making it invisible to casual inspection. Even more sophisticated was the integration of tunnel access with the restaurant's normal operations. Deliveries from the tunnel were timed to coincide with legitimate food deliveries, allowing contraband to be moved through the restaurant without attracting attention from customers or neighbors. The level of planning and investment suggests this operation was coordinated at the highest levels of cartel leadership, continued Patterson. We're not dealing with opportunistic smugglers. This represents a systematic attempt to create permanent infrastructure for circumventing American border security. Intelligence gathered from multiple sources had identified the mastermind behind the tunnel system as Joaquin El Ingeniero Vega, a former civil engineer who had joined the Sinaloa cartel after his construction company was driven out of business by cartel intimidation in Culiacan. Vega represented a new generation of cartel leadership, highly educated professionals who had applied legitimate business and technical skills to criminal enterprises. Vega's background was both impressive and disturbing. He had earned his engineering degree from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, one of Latin America's most prestigious institutions, and had completed additional training in tunnel construction techniques at mining engineering programs in Colorado and Chile. His construction company had built legitimate infrastructure projects throughout Mexico, including highway bridges, municipal water systems, and even security installations for Mexican government agencies. The transition from legitimate engineering to criminal operations had been gradual. Vega's company had initially been contracted to build defensive positions and storage facilities for cartel operations, using his engineering expertise to create structures that could withstand assault by Mexican military forces. These projects had demonstrated his value to cartel leadership while providing him with insights into their operational requirements and financial resources. But Vega's true innovation had been recognizing that tunnel construction could be systematized and scaled using the same project management techniques employed in legitimate construction. Rather than building individual tunnels as one-off projects, he had developed standardized designs that could be replicated across multiple border locations. The Arizona tunnel was actually the prototype for a larger network that intelligence suggested might include similar installations in California, New Mexico, and Texas. The standardization approach had multiple advantages. Construction costs were reduced through economies of scale and reusable engineering designs. Construction time was shortened through standardized procedures and prefabricated components. Most importantly, the technical expertise required for tunnel construction was distributed among multiple construction teams, reducing the risk of operational disruption if any single team was compromised. Vega's organization had grown to include over 300 personnel, from professional engineers and construction supervisors to specialized equipment operators and security teams. The organization operated with the discipline and hierarchy of a legitimate construction company, complete with project managers, quality control inspectors, and even human resources personnel who managed payroll and benefits for tunnel construction workers. Bondi studied the faces of the officials assembled around the briefing table. Each represented agencies that had devoted enormous resources to securing the border. Yet the cartels had managed to construct this elaborate system without detection. The implications went beyond law enforcement. This discovery raised fundamental questions about national security and the effectiveness of current border protection strategies. The tunnel discovery had revealed critical gaps in America's border security infrastructure. Despite billions of dollars invested in wall construction, electronic surveillance, and increased Border Patrol staffing, The cartels had successfully constructed a sophisticated smuggling network that had operated undetected for months. The tunnel system had essentially created a parallel border that existed entirely outside the reach of conventional security measures. More troubling was the realization that the tunnel represented just one component of a broader cartel strategy to systematically undermine American border security. Intelligence analysis suggested that while federal resources were focused on above-ground smuggling attempts, the cartels had been investing in underground infrastructure that would allow them to continue operations even if surface-level security measures were significantly enhanced. The strategic implications were staggering. If similar tunnel systems existed along other sections of the border, the cartels had essentially created a clandestine transportation network that rivaled the capacity of legitimate commercial shipping. The Arizona Tunnel alone could transport over 50 tons of contraband monthly, representing more cargo capacity than many legitimate trucking companies. Border Patrol Chief Maria Santos, a 30-year veteran who had worked every sector of the southern border, spoke with barely controlled anger. "Ma'am, if they can build something this sophisticated without our knowledge, we have to assume there are other tunnel systems we haven't discovered. The resources required for this project suggest the cartels are generating revenue streams we've significantly underestimated." Santos had spent her career watching the evolution of border security challenges. She had witnessed the cartel's progression from simple human smuggling operations to sophisticated drug trafficking networks to the current situation where they operated like quasi-governmental organizations with their own infrastructure, intelligence capabilities, and financial systems. Her anger was personal as well as professional. Santos had grown up in a border community where cartel violence had transformed daily life. Children who had once played safely in neighborhood parks now lived in fear of recruitment by cartel organizations. Small businesses that had anchored community economic life had been destroyed by extortion and intimidation. Families had been torn apart by violence that seemed to escalate regardless of law enforcement responses. The tunnel discovery represented everything wrong with the current situation. The cartels had become so confident in their power and resources that they were willing to invest enormous sums in permanent infrastructure for criminal operations. They were essentially challenging the sovereignty of the United States, creating their own systems for moving people and goods across the border while ignoring American law and authority. The financial implications were staggering. Intelligence analysis suggested that the tunnel system could transport over a ton of cocaine per week, representing wholesale value of approximately $50 million monthly. But cocaine was likely just one component of the smuggling operation. Evidence gathered from surveillance of the tunnel suggested it was also being used for human trafficking, specifically the transport of young women and children destined for forced labor and sexual exploitation. Immigration and Customs Enforcement investigators had identified over 200 missing persons cases that might be connected to victims transported through the tunnel system. Perhaps most alarming were the weapons discoveries. Federal agents had found evidence that the tunnels were being used to transport military-grade firearms from the United States into Mexico, where they were sold to cartel enforcement teams. This created a deadly cycle where American weapons were being used to escalate cartel violence, which in turn drove more refugees to attempt border crossings that enriched the same criminal organizations. "This isn't just drug smuggling," Bondi observed, studying intelligence reports spread across the conference table. "This is a comprehensive criminal enterprise that threatens American national security on multiple levels. The cartels aren't just moving drugs, they're moving people, weapons, and potentially anything else that serves their interests." FBI Assistant Director Sarah Martinez presented the intelligence picture that had emerged from weeks of surveillance and investigation. The tunnel operation was controlled directly by Joaquin El Ingeniero Vega, a former civil engineer who had joined the Sinaloa cartel after his construction company was driven out of business by cartel intimidation. Vega had applied his engineering expertise to create what federal investigators were calling the most sophisticated smuggling infrastructure ever discovered. Vega's operation employed over 50 people on both sides of the border, including legitimate business owners who had been coerced into cooperation, construction workers who had built the tunnels, and security personnel who monitored the system around the clock. The organization had invested in counter-surveillance technology, including equipment designed to detect ground-penetrating radar and seismic monitoring systems used by American law enforcement. The level of technical sophistication suggests they've been studying our detection methods and specifically designing countermeasures, Martinez explained. They've essentially weaponized civil engineering against American border security. The tunnel discovery had been kept secret for 3 weeks, while federal agencies developed a comprehensive response strategy. Revealing the tunnel's existence prematurely could allow the cartels to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, and begin construction of alternative systems before law enforcement could respond effectively. But the secrecy had created its own challenges. Border Patrol agents in the sector continued their normal operations without knowledge of the tunnel system, potentially placing them at risk if cartel security forces believed their operations were under surveillance. DEA and FBI agents had to conduct investigation and planning without the full resources normally available for major operations. The operational security requirements have been unprecedented, acknowledged Homeland Security Deputy Director Michael Torres. We've been operating under the assumption that cartel intelligence networks have penetrated multiple levels of federal law enforcement. Every briefing, every communication, every operational movement has been compartmentalized to prevent information from reaching cartel leadership. The paranoia was justified. Previous investigations had revealed that cartels had successfully recruited informants within Border Patrol, DEA, and even FBI field offices. The financial resources available to cartel organizations allowed them to offer bribes that exceeded the annual salaries of federal agents, creating constant temptation for personnel facing financial pressures. Bondi had personally reviewed the security protocols for the tunnel investigation, requiring that all personnel involved submit to enhanced background checks and polygraph examinations. Even senior officials had been excluded from planning sessions unless their participation was absolutely necessary. The tunnel represents more than a law enforcement challenge, Bondi told the assembled officials. It's a direct attack on American sovereignty. The cartels are essentially attempting to create their own infrastructure for circumventing our laws and our borders. This cannot be tolerated. The response strategy had taken weeks to develop and would require unprecedented coordination between multiple agencies and both federal and state authorities. The operation, designated Mole Hunt, would involve simultaneous raids on both sides of the border, requiring cooperation with Mexican authorities who might themselves be compromised by cartel infiltration. On the American side, federal agents would raid the restaurant serving as the tunnel entrance, while simultaneously executing search warrants at over 30 locations identified as part of the smuggling network. The coordinated raids would target not just the physical infrastructure, but the financial networks that had funded the tunnel construction and the human resources that kept the operation functioning. The Mexican component was more complex. Mexican federal authorities had been briefed on the tunnel discovery, but operational details were being shared only with a small group of officials whose loyalty had been verified through intelligence channels. The risk of cartel infiltration within Mexican law enforcement was significant enough that American officials were prepared to conduct unilateral operations if necessary. "Agent Castellanos," Bondi said, turning to the Border Patrol agent whose initial observations had led to the tunnel discovery, "I want you to personally lead the team that secures the American entrance. You've earned the right to see this operation through to completion." Castellanos nodded grimly. She had grown up in the border region and had seen how cartel violence had transformed communities that had once been safe and prosperous. The tunnel discovery represented everything wrong with the current situation. Cartels were so confident in their power that they were willing to invest massive resources in permanent infrastructure for criminal operations. "Ma'am, with respect, this tunnel probably isn't unique. If the cartels invested this much in one location, they've likely built similar systems elsewhere. We need to fundamentally reconsider our approach to border security." Bondi agreed completely. The tunnel discovery had revealed that traditional border security measures were inadequate against adversaries, with the resources and determination of major cartel organizations. The cartels were operating like nation-states, with sophisticated intelligence capabilities, advanced technology, and financial resources that rivaled those of many legitimate governments. "That's exactly why we're not just shutting down this tunnel," Bondi announced. "We're using it as the foundation for the largest anti-cartel operation in American history. Operation Mole Hunt will dismantle not just this smuggling network, but the entire infrastructure that made it possible. The plan was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted against cartel organizations. Federal agencies would coordinate with international partners to simultaneously target cartel operations across multiple countries, using intelligence gathered from the tunnel investigation to identify and disrupt criminal networks from Mexico to Colombia to Europe. Financial investigators had traced money laundering networks connected to the tunnel operation through banks in 7 countries. Weapons trafficking networks had been mapped across the entire North American continent. Human trafficking routes had been identified, stretching from Central America to major American cities. The tunnel was their mistake, Bondi concluded. Studying the engineering diagrams that covered the briefing room walls, they invested so much in this one operation that they exposed the entire scope of their criminal enterprise. Now we're going to use their own success against them. The briefing concluded with operational assignments that would put hundreds of federal agents into action within hours. The tunnel that the cartels had intended as their greatest achievement would become the foundation for their greatest defeat. As the officials filed out of the briefing room to begin preparations for Operation Mole Hunt, Bondi remained behind, studying the satellite imagery of the Arizona desert. Somewhere beneath that seemingly empty terrain lay a tunnel system that represented everything wrong with current approaches to border security and drug enforcement, but it also represented an opportunity, the chance to demonstrate that American law enforcement could adapt and respond to even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The cartels had underestimated the determination and capabilities of American authorities, and they were about to discover the cost of that miscalculation. Within 72 hours, Operation Mole Hunt would begin, and the tunnel system that had taken 3 years to build would become the key to dismantling criminal networks that had operated with impunity for decades. The cartels had built their own tomb, and Attorney General Pam Bondi was about to bury them in it.